All right, this is going to be an exciting episode. We've got all the way from Australia, actually Tasmania, Louis Proud with us. He's a writer and a researcher specializing in Fortean or anomalous phenomena. I'm gonna read the titles of his last few books just because it really gives us an idea of the breadth of research he's been doing. Dark
Yes.
Intrusions, an investigation into the paranormal nature of sleep and sleep paralysis. The Secret Influence of the Moon, Alien Origins and Occult Powers, Strange Electromagnetic Dimensions, The Science of the Unexplainable, in that book. And then he's got a new book coming out. It's going to be called Borderland Phenomena. Volume 1 will be Spontaneous Combustion, Poltergeistry, and Anomalous Light. So there's lots for us to talk about here. Especially interesting is the Strange Electromagnetic Dimensions that was, his previous book, and it kind of overlaps into his new book. So I don't want to keep rambling here. Thanks for coming on, Louis.
Oh, thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, really interested when I was watching your videos and reading some of your books there. It's I don't even know where to begin because it's I got a lot of questions about the electromagnetic dimensions. If you don't mind starting there, maybe before we get into your new book, or we could even start a little bit further back than that. I mean, you take.
Yep.
From what I know, you take a pretty scientific approach to the paranormal, so you're not really afraid to hit it with science, but then also keep an open mind there for something that's still unexplainable. Do you want to start with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, I do take a fairly scientific approach to, investigating or exploring these sorts of subjects. And I always like to sort of base it in the natural world. I suppose that's really my perspective on this. I don't like the term supernatural, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that all of these things are part of the natural world. Science just hasn't got around to understanding them yet. So that's really the way I kind of look at it. And the same was the UFO phenomenon too. I'm very skeptical of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, for example. I sort of go more for the Earth lights, ball lightning angle when it comes to UFOs. That really sort of sums up my perspective or my approach to looking at these sorts of topics.
Mm-hmm. So how did you become interested in it?
I think it's partly due to my childhood because I grew up in a fairly remote area. I actually spent a large part of my childhood in Tasmania, sorry. We lived, I suppose, very, fairly close to nature. We didn't really sort of watch television much. I feel that if you really want to connect to these sorts of things, you've got to have that sort of connection to nature, I suppose. These sorts of experiences do tend to occur in sort of natural settings. Think of Whitley Strieber, for example, how a lot of his so-called abduction experiences occurred, in that remote cabin, for example. So, you hear stories of, a lot of these contact experiences or UFO experiences happening, in the desert, for example, that kind of thing. So I think that really helped. It sort of made me more aware of the paranormal, I suppose, because it's a very subtle, sort of elusive thing, and it only manifests under very special conditions. But also in my late teens, early 20s, I had quite a few sleep paralysis experiences as well. And I'm sure most people are familiar with what sleep paralysis is. Most people have experienced it. But in my case, it was these were very frequent episodes. And, so what happens is you're in a sort of, mind awake, body asleep state. It's a twilight state of consciousness. It's associated with hypnagogia,
Mm-hmm.
or the hypnagogic state. And all sorts of strange experiences can occur. So basically your body is paralyzed because it's normally paralyzed during REM sleep to, prevent you from acting out your dreams. And people often report very similar experiences. There'll usually be a heavy weight on your chest. Sometimes there'll be, voices will be heard. There's usually a sense presence. And no doubt there's, some of these experiences can be explained, just sort of physiologically. But there's some very weird aspects to sleep paralysis, which sort of seem to suggest that there could be something paranormal happening. And I wrote a book about it called Dark Intrusions, and I sort of place sleep paralysis in a sort of, in the broader paranormal context to try and understand, what I'd been through. And I found that there's all these remarkable connections between, sleep paralysis and mediumship and ufology, etc. So that certainly opened my eyes to, all this weird stuff, if you like. They were very transformative experiences.
Yeah, no doubt. Can you dig into that a little bit? I know a couple people that have that problem, it manifests as like incubus or succubus encounters, which can be quite terrifying. But can you sort of dig into a little bit about how you separate out, like how you can, how it's not just such a physical explanation for that. It's not just strictly like you're paralyzed, or there is a different dimension to that.
Yeah. Well, you've got to realize, first of all, that everyone's sleep paralysis experiences are different. Some people only experience a very sort of mild form of sleep paralysis. There is no sense presence. There are no so-called hallucinations. Other people have much more consistent, experiences where there's a lot more going on. And this can include, as I said, like a sense presence. You do feel as though there's an entity in the room with you. And sometimes you can be attacked and that sort of things. I mean, you'll feel sensations on your body. It's sometimes like a pair of hands around your neck, for example, or something like that. There's also another thing where sometimes it feels as though the entity or so-called entity is actually shaking the bed, rocking it back and forth. And we find that kind of thing in sort of haunted house type cases and that sort of thing. So a lot of places that are considered haunted, people have these types of experiences whenever they enter those locations, or at least they're more likely to occur. Don't happen to everyone, of course. You've got to be, I suppose, a little bit open to that sort of experience. But yeah, also the voices are very peculiar as well. I mean, you'll hear like a voice externally, and usually the comments are quite sort of cryptic, quite disturbing. So there's that really sort of terrifying aspect where people do feel as though they're battling with demons or evil spirits and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But the weird thing is that, it's sleep paralysis is considered, these experiences are considered hallucinations, and, hallucinations that arise from REM sleep. And so according to that explanation, pretty much anything should happen during sleep paralysis. And yet a lot of people describe the same sorts of things, such as the rocking bed sensation and that kind of thing. Cryptic comments heard in someone's ear, or sometimes directly inside your head, if you like. And also, the sensations of being touched. A lot of people talk about being strangled and that kind of thing. So it's some very, very, the thing is, you really need to experience it directly in order to be able to fully understand or appreciate, the complexity of the experience, I suppose. And a lot of people who've just had very mild sleep paralysis experiences without any so-called hallucinations will say, oh, there's nothing going on, But those people who've experienced it repeatedly and have had the more sort of violent sleep paralysis episodes would say that there's definitely something that can't be explained, as being purely physiological. There's some other component at work.
Did you come across any physical evidence from people getting, either beat up or attacked at night? Was there any evidence of that?
Look,
like bruising.
Sometimes,
and I know it's hard to prove, but was there any of that?
Well, the thing is that some of these same types of experiences can occur, as I said, in so-called haunted houses, and also they can accompany, poltergeist type incidents as well. So people who, like particularly the so-called poltergeist focus because poltergeists, of course, occur around a living person. And as we know, poltergeist is German for noisy or boisterous spirit. So these people often do report having these quite violent sleep paralysis episodes, and also witnessing some very strange activity that obviously does have an external component. Objects being thrown around the house and that kind of thing. So they certainly tie together, or they're quite closely associated. So I'd say that's really where the physical evidence is. So maybe in some cases sleep paralysis episodes are only internal. Maybe in other cases whatever is happening is externalized in some fashion, whereby there is that physical component, objects being thrown around, loud noises, etc. Yeah.
Huh. Yeah, it's fascinating. So then you ended up doing your research on the electromagnetic phenomena, and was there any connection there between, like that type of experience, like let's just call it poltergeist, even though it might be sleep paralysis as well, but let's call it that, the sixth sense that we sort of have in our being, and the electromagnetic thing? Like, is there some commonality there between those?
Right. Well, first of all, it's a very complex area, very multifaceted, and there was only so much I could cover in my book, Strange Electromagnetic Dimensions. But the reason I wrote that book was to because there is always an electromagnetic component to the paranormal. We see this in the case of poltergeist disturbances, where there are electromagnetic anomalies and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And also, this is, I'm probably going off on a bit of a tangent here, but the poltergeist agents or the focus, often those people report having a large build-up of static on their bodies, for example. They seem to generate an unusually large amount of static electricity. Some of these people do report also having suffered like an electric shock, or in some rare cases they claim to have been struck by lightning and that sort of thing. We find that in the case of a lot of psychics as well. Uri Geller, for example, when he was a child, he claims that he was basically fooling around with his mum's sewing machine, and he saw like a bright blue spark inside, and he put his finger in and he was thrown violently backwards. And after that, he developed, his psychic abilities, which include, being able to supposedly, bend cutlery by paranormal means and that sort of thing. So it is a very broad area, but yeah, certainly, I suppose if you want to narrow it down, there's, as I said, a lot of these people have experienced electric shock, mediums, poltergeist agents, because they are very closely related, of course. So that seems to almost kind of induce the phenomena, I suppose. Yeah, I'm probably I'm trying to cover too much here in the one question.
Yeah,
we might need to sort of narrow it down a little bit.
Yeah, well, let's get into the sixth sense part then. There is. Yep. I heard you talk about the magnetite, which I don't know if people realize that there is that in our brains. Yep. I guess, right? Is that somewhat responsible for some of this?
Yeah, look, that's certainly because first of all, the ability is called magnetoception, and it's the ability to detect a magnetic field, or the Earth's magnetic field in this case, and use it for navigational purposes. And a lot of animals have this ability. Homing pigeons, for example, mole rats, and turtles, etc. It's even been found in bacteria, and we know that this. Obviously, there is some kind of mechanism in the body that allows this to happen. This ability to sense a magnetic field, and they've done a lot of research on this. Scientists, they've discovered that that these animals that have this ability, they have particles of magnetite in their bodies. Some research has been done into this regarding human magnetoception. There have been experiments where there was a British biologist, Robin Baker, who did all these experiments in the 70s. He placed school children on buses, blindfolded them, and he'd take them on these long, winding trips through the countryside. They couldn't see any light or any other external cues, etc. And then he'd go out to a remote location. He'd tell them to step off the bus, and then he'd get them to point in the direction of home with the blindfold still on. And he discovered remarkably that a lot of these children were able to point in the direction of home, but yet when he removed the blindfold, they became completely disoriented, and they confused, and they didn't know which direction home was. So he came up with the theory that we do have this ability. It's a subconscious ability, and that we probably it would have been of benefit to our hunter-gatherer ancestors. So they would have made use of this ability to, to find their way around, and basically it would have been for survival purposes. But it makes sense that since the emergence of civilization and towns and cities, etc., and we remaining in one place. Yeah, that's true. Yes. Yep. Interference from artificial sources of electromagnetism
because you're basically
could interfere with this ability. Yep.
You're basically talking about the same thing that's letting whales find their way around the planet and migrate, and birds are flying north and south. So we got little fucking magnets in our skin or in our brain. Is that what's happening there? Basically, we got a magnetic particle inside our body.
Well, look, as I said, the evidence isn't conclusive, and I mean there have been studies where they have actually sort of taken apart human brain tissue, that they've tried to find these particles of magnetite, and they have actually, there is evidence that these particles do exist in human brain tissue. But once again, you've got to realize that that the fact that these particles might exist is not something that I suppose the authorities, if you like, would want to acknowledge, simply because it suggests that not only are we being affected by the Earth's magnetic field, but also artificial sources of electromagnetism. So it sort of indicates, or I suppose opens up the possibility that that we may be adversely affected by artificial electromagnetic fields. So a lot of this research, I wouldn't say it's necessarily been suppressed, but it hasn't been given a lot of attention. And the people who've done this kind of research, they've received a lot of criticism, etc. In the case of Robin Baker, for example, he did many experiments, and I think his evidence is quite strong that humans can sense the Earth's magnetic field. But he stopped doing that research. He just found that he wasn't getting anywhere. People weren't listening. So
there's no money in telling people to get rid of their cell phones or their televisions. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So, but yeah, it is.
So if we're talking about I mean, I gotta say, when I see things like that we got this the idea of having a magnetic particle inside us for purpose of migration and things like that makes a lot of sense to me. When I start thinking about magnets and as being possible for the sixth sense or things like that, it makes me go back to, makes me think simulation again. I mean, it's hard not to think simulation when the electromagnetism starts affecting things like that we're not in some sort of computer that, I don't know. Is that off base, do you think, or?
Look, I don't, the simulation hypothesis, I haven't really looked into that much, to be honest. But I suppose the way I see it is, it just makes sense that we would have these particles of magnetite in the body, simply because, like other animals do, and it's how that we remain, I suppose, tuned to the Earth's electromagnetic field, Schumann resonance signals and that kind of thing. I mean, we evolved in the presence of the Earth's magnetic field, so of course we're going to be tuned to that field. And I mean, they have done experiments too in circadian rhythms. It's a known fact that, of course, if you're not exposed to any light, if you're kept, say, in an underground bunker, your circadian rhythms are going to, slip out of phase, basically, with the light-dark cycle.
Does it
And it's
does
been
that
found.
happen at like a scheduled rate? Like if you have an old watch that loses like 3 minutes a day, does your circadian rhythm lose any a set amount of data? Like how long does it take before you're completely fucking backwards from the rest of the planet? You're up, it's dark, you're going to sleep just as the sun's
Yeah.
coming up, you're fucked.
Yeah.
Does that take like a
Yeah,
week, do you think, or is it random, or does it take? I wonder how that works. I'm curious now. We should throw Graham in something.
I'm not sure specifically how long it takes. I know that these experiments have been done over quite lengthy periods, so many, many months, for example. I'd say it is a gradual process. I did read too that so instead of being like a 24-hour cycle, it lengthens. It becomes like around 25 hours, that kind of thing. These biological cycles in the body. But the point I wanted to come to there was the fact that the Earth's magnetic field plays a role in this. I mean, it's known that if a person is completely shielded from the Earth's magnetic field, that this is more likely to occur, that their circadian rhythms are going to slip out of phase. And they have found too that if they introduce a magnetic field or electric field of around 10 hertz, that actually can restore a person's circadian rhythm. So, yeah. So, so certainly that's one aspect of. I mean, we're tuned to the light-dark cycle. We're tuned to the Earth's magnetic field. All of these things are, enabling us to our bodies to function, in a particular way. And we're not exposed to these things. Well, we become completely out of tune with the Earth, and it can affect our health, etc.
Yeah, you mentioned quite a bit about the circadian rhythms being off, affecting your health, like the sleep.
Yeah.
The sleep problem really affects our health, but then there's also the artificial electromagnetic fields, like the power lines, and I don't know if if 5G is included in there somewhere, but do you see evidence of a negative impact on our health and well-being from those?
Sorry, what was that thing that you mentioned just there? I do apologize.
The 5G.
Oh, okay.
And the power
right.
lines and the circadian rhythms. Like it seems like that would all be connected at some point. Yeah,
look, I mean they've done a lot of studies in this. So it seems to be it certainly ties into the pineal gland, which of course produces melatonin. So they have found that when a person is exposed to certain kinds of artificial electromagnetic fields, that it can actually interfere with the production of melatonin. Basically, it seems to suppress the production of melatonin. And then what happens, of course, is that person's sleep-wake cycle, sort of is interfered with. And then, of course, that can affect the immune system, and they'll be more likely to get ill, of course. So they have done quite a few studies into this, and it's even been discovered too that the Earth's magnetic field, or during times when the Earth's magnetic field is disturbed, solar storms, etc.
Mm-hmm.
That can actually contribute to this. It can sort of suppresses the production of melatonin, and there's actually a link too between geomagnetic disturbances and suicide rates. Suicide rates actually peak around those times as well. So
is that because people can't sleep?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
That'll do it.
So I wonder what, like, I was with a friend of mine this morning for coffee, and he was talking about how one of the guys that he used to train was I think he was a electrical engineer or something, but he came down with ALS, and then within 9 months he was really, really bad. I mean, have you seen any specific health issues around some of this, like something like ALS that would affect your nervous system, and why are some people sensitive to this and others aren't?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I wouldn't be able to answer that question, why some people are more sensitive than others. But I think that makes sense, that some people would be more sensitive than others. I mean, there is a condition called electromagnetic hypersensitivity, which is a very controversial condition. And these are people who say that they that they're basically allergic to artificial sources of electromagnetism, that they can develop rashes on their body, and they feel very, very sick. They lose the ability to concentrate. They can get headaches, etc. And there has been some research into this to try and work out whether or not it's it's really all in their minds, or if there is actually a genuine allergic response occurring in the body. And there is some evidence that it is a genuine allergic response, similar to other types of allergic reactions. So yeah, it seems as though some people are just more sensitive than others. I mean, I suppose you got to allow for mental health issues and that sort of thing. But we need to realize too that this is all, that we're very much the guinea pigs in all this. I mean, this the widespread use of electricity, the use of electricity on a large scale, it's only really been going on for about 80 years. Yeah. So it's a very recent thing in the history of humanity.
Yeah, good point.
Throw in a little Wi-Fi, sprinkle a little Wi-Fi on.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean,
some cell signals. We'll throw in some radio signals, some satellite signals. We'll throw sprinkle some brake dust on there.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned 5G before too, which is another thing that's being rolled out. And these are much smaller waves than microwaves too. Like millimeter-sized waves. So. And they're
just
going
so
to be,
people know, microwaves are what you use to microwave things in your microwave.
Well, yeah. Look, see, the thing is, with a microwave oven, it's like high intensity microwave radiation, which that has like a thermal effect on the body. It actually heats, the tissue, and hence you can use microwaves to heat up food. But so cell phone towers and that sort of thing, they're using microwaves, but they're using like low intensity microwaves. So they've found that, okay, there are no thermal effects occurring. It's not heating, bodily tissue or anything like that. So that the controversy is really centered around whether there are non-thermal effects associated with this form of radiation. Non-ionizing radiation is what it's classified as. But
so does that mean that cell phones could be responsible for global warming?
Global warming. I don't know about that one. I don't have any information on that topic. I'd say that's probably unlikely. But yeah, bear in mind, I'm not a scientist or anything like that. I'm just a humble researcher. My job was just to try and sort of connect the dots.
Collate the research and connect the dots. That's what we need, though. That's great. So what is high voltage syndrome different than the sensitivity, the hypersensitivity one?
Right. I see. So high voltage syndrome, that's what we refer to as electric people. So that's the name for that condition.
Oh, okay. So it is different. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So there are a lot of different terms out there. But yeah, high voltage syndrome. So basically, these are people who claim that they exert an odd effect on electrical equipment. So, for example, they claim that if they wear a wristwatch, that it malfunctions within a very short period of time. That they can't go near computers because they'll crash and that sort of thing.
Email problems.
And also, yeah, exactly. So they just have a strange effect on electrical equipment. And also they claim too that their bodies build up an unusually large amount of static electricity as well. And of course this does tie into like poltergeist agents as well, because quite a few poltergeist agents are also, electric people. But I suppose one of the most sort of modern manifestations of this would be the street lamp interference phenomenon. And I get a lot of emails from people still, because I wrote an article on this and I posted it online. And still to this day, this was many years ago that I wrote the article, I'm still getting emails from people saying that, whenever I walk near street lamps, they blink on or they blink off. I seem to be affecting them just with my presence, which is very mysterious.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Hmm.
And so
Yeah.
you're seeing a lot of that then, a lot of people coming forward and talking
Yeah,
about that.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah, it seems to affect a lot of people. And and the thing is too. Well, I sort of came to the conclusion that maybe street lamps are particularly sensitive. They could in fact be influencing other gadgets as well, or other forms of equipment and that sort of thing. But perhaps street lamps are particularly sensitive to some kind of influence. Um, but yeah, it's very mysterious. I think there might be psychokinesis could be involved. Sort of mind over matter kind of thing.
like a subconscious psychokinesis. I mean, it's
Yeah,
hard to
exactly.
believe that
Yep.
some people it's hard to believe that some people, some guys can get hit by lightning like 7 times, and some
Yep.
people this happens to, and most people it doesn't. Like, what's the difference in the people? Is it because their makeup is
Yep.
different, or are they, you
Yep.
know?
Yeah. Well, I looked into some of the causes of I suppose high voltage syndrome. How these people become electric people.
Okay.
And certainly, in a lot of cases, it was due to electric shock. A lot of them do report having been, that they had an accident at home where they might have tried to plug in a faulty refrigerator or something like that, and they got an electric shock. And since then, they've had this weird influence on electrical gadgets, and also like an emotional crisis seems to be able to bring it about as well. So sometimes people become electric people after the death of a loved one, someone they were close to, and also lightning as well. I did actually exchange quite a few emails with people who claim that that they have been struck by lightning, and that's what brought it about. So, and there's also this fascinating article that I mentioned in my book, Strange Electromagnetic Dimensions. This was a case in 1920 in a prison, Clinton Prison in Dan Morrow, New York, where there were, I think it was 34 prisoners developed what were described as peculiar static electric powers after eating contaminated salmon. So they developed botulism, and they basically, while they were sick with this, with botulism, they as I said, they had these peculiar static electric powers, and all sorts of weird things were reported. Like, one man was he scrunched up a piece of paper and he was about to throw it into the bin, but it actually stuck to his hand, and that kind of thing. And apparently, they were able to transfer this. Or they're able to make objects sort of statically charged and like a piece of paper, and then sort of place it on a wall, and it would remain, sticking to the wall and that kind of thing. But the weird thing is that it doesn't seem to be explainable just by static electricity alone, because apparently these prisoners were actually remaining statically charged even when their bodies were earthed. For example, when they were in the bath and that kind of thing. And certainly under those conditions, there shouldn't be any static electricity clinging to the body. So it's very strange. As I said, it seems to tie into psychokinesis. There's definitely a sort of a paranormal aspect to this. We do know that the human body, it can become statically charged. And certainly the human body itself is sort of electrochemical machine, if you like. We have, of course, there's nerve cells, muscle cells, and there is a very weak electromagnetic field around the body, but it's a very weak field.
Is that the same as your chi?
Sorry, what was that?
Is that the same as your chi, your electromagnetic field?
Right. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. With things like chi and so on, those sorts of terms, it's really referring to these kind of subtle energies, and this is very much a universal belief. The Chinese they'll call it chi energy, sort of life force energy. Mesmer, of course, talked about animal magnetism. And then, of course, there's orgone energy, which is what Wilhelm Reich termed it.
Who's Wilhelm Reich again? Is he a Nazi? No.
Was he a Nazi? I don't think so. No, I certainly wouldn't call him a Nazi. But yeah, look, the reason I mentioned Reich is as I said, in relation to orgone, and he claimed to have found scientific evidence for this sort of life force energy, and he thought that it was distinct from electromagnetism. It was basically a different type of energy, and that the two are actually antagonistic. So that, for example, that orgone could become contaminated, if you will, upon being exposed to sources of electromagnetism. But yeah, he called it basically life force energy, that kind of thing, vital energy. So it's very much a universal belief. And I do look at the theory in my book that perhaps this is the energy behind psi phenomena, psychokinesis, telepathy, etc. Maybe that is the type of energy that's being exchanged, if you like. So I think that's a very interesting idea as well.
Looks like Wilhelm Reich's book was banned by the Nazis, so probably not a Nazi.
Yeah.
But it does say
We've
here
talked
that-
about him before. I can't believe you're asking these questions. I mean, we talked. He's the one that was involved in the weather modification and like Oregon to disperse clouds and stuff like that.
Oh, is he?
Yeah.
Says here he's also got some ties to the free love movement because he claimed that better orgasms could cure society's ills.
He's probably right. There you go. Lots of chi in those.
Is there?
Yeah.
Pow. Good, watch you don't spontaneously combust. You're getting busy with yourself. Is that an issue? What do you think? Spontaneous human combustion, is that? What do you think's going on there? Is that overcheating?
I always thought it was somebody just like with their cig. I mean, wasn't the skeptical answer way back when those magazines first came out talking about it in the 80s, I think it was, or the 70s, that somebody just like was full of alcohol and their cigarette had burned down and caught them on fire? I hope those have been debunked since then.
Yeah, look, that's it's a topic I look at quite closely in my upcoming book, Borderland Phenomena. There is a section there on spontaneous human combustion. It's a mystery I've always been fascinated with. It doesn't seem to get a lot of attention these days. A lot of people think that it has been debunked, I suppose.
Yeah, maybe that's why it's like still left over from decades ago. Just like the Bermuda Triangle, same thing.
Yep. Yeah, look, it is kind of sort of placed in that same sort of category. Yeah. But there's some really intriguing, well-documented cases, and it still occurs to this day, of course. It doesn't get as much publicity, I suppose. But basically, it's where a body is almost completely incinerated when there seems to be no external source of ignition. And usually it seems to happen over a fairly short period of time, like within an 8 to 10 hour period. The very weird thing is that, it's very difficult to reduce a body to ashes because we're talking about the almost complete incineration of a human body. There might sort of be like a limb remaining, that kind of thing, sometimes a foot or something like that. Usually the torso is completely burnt away. But the bones in some cases are completely, as I say, completely reduced to ash, which is very peculiar because even if you try to, burn a body in a crematorium, it takes a very high temperature, a lot of energy to reduce a body to ash. And even then the bones are actually, they need to be crushed in order to be reduced to ash. They've actually got to put them in a device that's called a cremulator, which sort of basically these large ball bearings spin around and crush the bones and that sort of thing. So the question is, how does this happen? How, what is the source of energy involved, I suppose? And I mean, if you sort of look on the internet, like you look at some of the more sort of skeptical articles and that sort of thing, they'll all say that it's to do with the Wick effect, which is the theory that the human body is more or less similar to a sort of a candle in the sense, or an inside-out candle, where the clothing is the wick and the fat is the fuel. And that what's happening is there is some form of external ignition, maybe a dropped cigarette or something like that, a spark from a fire, a hot ember or whatever. And that person, usually they are elderly people who aren't very mobile. So the theory is that their clothing catches on fire, and that starts to melt the fat, and then it sort of draws the fat out of the body, and it sort of continues to burn, very slowly, sort of smolders. And that over a very long period, then that basically is what reduces the body to ash. But they've tried to replicate this in, they've done all sorts of experiments to try and do this with like pig carcasses and that sort of thing. And none of those experiments have been very successful. I mean, they've had difficulty trying to light these bodies, these pig carcasses, for example. They've had to sometimes pour gasoline on them and that sort of thing. So it's really is a huge mystery, but there are many theories for what causes spontaneous human combustion.
What's
your favorite?
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, I mean, there's I suppose. Well, in my book, I really focused on the sort of poltergeist angle, and this is something that a writer by the name of Vincent Gaddis. I don't know if you guys have heard of him. He was a very famous Fortean author. I wrote a lot about the Bermuda Triangle. Apparently he coined that term, Bermuda Triangle. But he wrote this fantastic book called Mysterious Fires and Lights. And I recommend to everyone who's interested in Fortean stuff to try and get a copy of this book. I think you can find it through I think Borderland Sciences Foundation. It's a really interesting book. But he came up with the theory that, and he tied it into poltergeistry. He said that, in the case of poltergeists, cases, so in the case of poltergeist, what's happening is the energy is being externalized, because he did believe it was due to the subconscious. It was the person's subconscious causing these things to occur. And he said it's the energy is externalized and it's used to move objects around, etc. But in the case of spontaneous human combustion, the energy is actually internalized. And he described it as a form of sort of subconscious suicide. And he mentions the fact that a lot of these victims were actually very depressed individuals. So it's almost as though because of their mental state, that sort of triggered something in the body that where this energy was internalized, and then the person sort of basically burst into flames, which I know sounds a little bit comical, but I think that's a really fascinating way of looking at it.
Another term to burn up inside. You're burning up inside.
I wonder if you could just like raise your vibration too high, and then you just that's it.
Too low, I think.
Too low?
Yeah. You're angry and upset, and if you're raising it high, then you wouldn't catch on fire.
But Michael is high.
Well, I mean, the thing is interesting. You mentioned that because you would have heard of the theory that that these experiences are due to the awakening of Kundalini energy, because these yogis, they talk about this that when they're undergoing that experience of awakening, this energy that's sort of supposed to lie at the base of the spine and sort of like in the form of they talk about like a sort of coiled serpent, and it rises up through the body and activates the chakras and this kind of thing. And they sometimes describe it as being sort of a burning sensation. They talk about how if you awaken your Kundalini energy too quickly, you can actually, they talk about it actually, the person can either sort of go mad or they can actually catch on fire. So that's another way of looking at it as well. The Kundalini energy theory.
Take it easy.
Yeah. So yeah, apparently if you activate it too quickly and in the wrong manner, it can have disastrous effects. Yeah.
But I don't think this guy's sitting at home drunk with his cigar activating his Kundalini.
No,
that's the thing. I mean, these people who these victims of SHC, they're not necessarily people who would meditate or anything like that. They're usually sort of depressed loners, who aren't interested in anything spiritual, I suppose. So I don't think these are necessarily related to Kundalini energy or anything like that. But I think that's a very interesting angle. And then there's the whole, the Tibetan monks have a practice called tumo, where they try to they're apparently able to basically sort of sit in the snow and heat their bodies to the extent where they don't actually need any clothing or anything like that, and they're able to melt the snow around them. And this is something that Alexandra David Neal talks about in her book about Tibet. She traveled throughout Tibet and sort of documented some of this stuff. So, that's another way of looking at it too. That possibly it's got to do with the activation of some sort of energy in the body, but in the case of SHC, it sort of goes haywire or something like that.
Yeah.
But,
yeah, I mean, look at what the Iceman does. Wim Hof, right? He can run in the desert in his shorts, or up Mount Everest in his shorts. I mean, it's all through his breathing technique where he regulates his body temperature, and he can, become hot under the ice or freezing cold in the desert. So, like you said, it's so he's doing it somehow. Organically, biologically, and maybe this is like, just like you said, it's that thing, but out of control, like something sort of.
Exactly. Yep.
So what about ball light? I'm interested in this. We talk about UFOs all the time. Ball lightning. I heard you talk about that maybe being responsible for some of the sort of orb style sightings, that kind of thing. You want to explain that a little bit? Because it's pretty interesting to me. It's hard to imagine ball lightning going in and out of places and keyholes and chimneys and stuff like that. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is have to be one of my favorite topics, ball lightning. And this is once again, this is something that science is only really accepted in recent decades. That there are many sightings of ball lightning. Going back through human history, but it was only really until like the 1970s that scientists said, okay, this thing does actually exist. And basically these are like small balls of light, usually about the size of a grapefruit. They can be a variety of different colors, so red, blue, yellow, orange. And ball lightning usually manifests during thunderstorm activity. It usually occurs after a strike of lightning to the ground, and usually what happens is these objects, they'll basically just stick around for a few seconds and then they explode. In some cases, quite violently. So ball lightning has a very short lifespan in most cases. But the weird thing is that there are cases where the object remains for a longer period of time, and it seems to exhibit some kind of intelligence. So there's heaps of sightings of, for example, ball lightning. Yes, it can squeeze through the keyhole of a door. That's reported. There aren't many reports like that, but I've come across quite a few. But usually what will happen is, there'll be like an open window or something like that. The object will enter the home via the window, and in some cases it will very carefully explore the room, and then it will exit via the window, the same window, that kind of thing. So definitely seems to exhibit some form of intelligence. Yeah.
Well, or is it just simply following the electrical current, or like around the room and out the door? I mean, is it just taking the path of least resistance or something like that?
Through the fucking keyhole is the path of least resistance?
Well, the only way out. I mean, obviously it doesn't go under the door, it goes through the keyhole. I mean, what you think it's... so do you think there's some intelligence, or is it just strictly a electromagnetic type thing?
Yeah, look, I mean, I suppose most scientists would probably say, oh, look, it's just sort of following the electrical wires and that sort of thing. It just appears to be behaving in an intelligent manner. But, I've come across reports where, for example, there was one case where the object enters the room and it was, it was like hovering over a rug, and it was actually tracing the patterns in the rug, which is very mysterious. It was basically, sort of following those patterns in the rug, which is, how do you explain something like that, for example? And also the other thing too is sometimes it will very carefully circle around a person and that kind of thing.
So how
and-
could you why isn't that an orb then? Like, how do you tell the difference between ball lightning and a legit orb?
Yep. Well, that's a good question, because the thing is that it all depends on really what kind of label we give these things. I mean, in the case of ball lightning, usually it's reported as ball lightning when it manifests during a thunderstorm.
Yeah.
And so there's that association, but it's kind of a loose association because sometimes these objects are reported during fine weather as well. But it seems as though we're dealing with a whole variety of different phenomena.
Yeah.
And then you have things like earth lights, for example, which tend to sort of haunt specific locations, and they seem to be associated with the geology of the area. So, deposits of minerals and fault lines and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And there seems to be a different sort of mechanism involved. But these things are very much connected to the Earth. They are produced by the Earth. But in some cases, in some very rare cases, they do seem to have some form of intelligence, and you certainly see that in the case of Earth lights. I mean, you may have read some of Paul Devereaux's books on Earth lights.
We had him on a couple of years ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I thought we had Paul Devereaux on.
Yeah. Really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, but the thing is too, in my books, I've looked at this in relation to the Foo Fighter phenomenon as well. So this is really how the modern era of UFOs came into being. It really goes back earlier than Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting. It goes back to World War II, when the radar was being developed, and the Allies were seeing these strange objects, these balls of light, small balls of light that would toy with their planes and that sort of thing. Sometimes circle around the aircraft, and they, totally confusing and baffling these pilots. And of course, the Allies thought, well, it's probably some form of secret weapon developed by the Nazis, etc. But then it turns out, of course, the Germans and the Japanese were also seeing these things as well. The extraterrestrial hypothesis would suggest, or would argue, I suppose, that these were sort of alien probes or something like that. But I really see it in terms of a sort of a natural phenomenon. And then, of course, interestingly enough, too, was Kenneth Arnold's sighting of those 9 shiny objects that he described in the state of Washington. He actually later came to believe that what he'd actually seen was some form of life. This relates to the sky creature theory, which says that UFOs are actually living creatures that inhabit the atmosphere and only manifest under very special conditions. So Kenneth Arnold actually subscribed to that theory. He didn't think that what he saw that day, and he did have other sightings as well, was actually extraterrestrial in origin. He thought it was some form of life that we weren't really able to, or that we knew very little about, and that scientists would one day sort of be able to study and understand, I suppose. That was his take on it.
The thing I don't understand about the Foo Fighters and that being a natural phenomenon is, then where did it go?
Yep.
Why did it just disappear? I mean, why?
Yep.
Why in that war, which would it just all of a sudden then did we change the way we're like how?
Yep. Yeah, that's a very good question. But that seems to be the case with the UFO phenomenon, where there seems to be all these different phases to it, I suppose. There was the Foo Fighter phenomenon. There were reports of sort of cigar-shaped objects and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then I suppose there are the more sort of sophisticated sightings, and then we have like the abduction phenomenon, etc. But with the Foo Fighters, there's this great book called The Cosmic Pulse of Life. You may have read it. It's by a man named Trevor James Constable. And he developed a theory that what was actually happening was, because of the widespread use of radar, because we were sort of sending out all these there's microwaves into the atmosphere, bombarding the atmosphere with microwave energy, that was actually having a negative impact on these living creatures. And that was interfering with them to the point where they were sort of manifesting, I suppose. And he believes that was the case with the Foo Fighters. He believed that they were normally invisible, but under certain special conditions they could manifest. And he said it was to do with mankind's use of artificial sources of electromagnetism, sort of energizing the planet and allowing these things to appear, I suppose, to human vision.
That's like some Final Fantasy shit right there. Well, I was going to say, because they say that life on Earth might have started from lightning striking the primordial soup or whatever the fuck you want to call it. But if we're seeing Graham and I were just watching a video, there's some ball lightning in Siberia where the lightning strikes, and then you've got this ball there.
Bright though, like that.
It just makes you wonder if it isn't some sort of, if life isn't created there for a second, and then it sort of fucking fithers out somehow. Almost like a glitch in the Matrix for a second, where it's not supposed to happen, but it just happened, and then because it's not in the primordial soup, it just evaporates. Is that or some like Star Trek Q stuff going on? Maybe he's like. Remember Q in Star Trek before QAnon ruined everything? It was just like that ultimate being that could just do whatever he wanted.
Right. I must admit I'm not familiar with that character.
No, me neither. What is he talking about?
You guys are just...
character, all right.
But look, I mean, we may be dealing with some sort of plasma-based life. And maybe this life form inhabits another dimension, like a parallel dimension or something like that, but it is able to manifest in our dimension, and in order to do that, it has to take on some kind of physical form, and it chooses plasma to manifest in physical form. I mean, that's a good point. That's a pretty wild theory, but I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, or just using it as a vehicle, or it could be manifesting, or maybe just riding along.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
And that kind of brings me to
it's a universe trying to observe itself.
Yeah.
Without psychedelics.
Yeah, but yet you're not so much of a proponent of the ETH, extraterrestrial hypothesis.
No, not really. I to begin with, when I first started looking into the UFO phenomenon. Probably would have been in my teens at that point. I was reading a lot of books on it, and I was really sucked into this all this abduction stuff, and I did truly believe that these were physical beings that were coming down and taking people and experimenting on them and that kind of thing. But the closer I looked at it, I saw less and less evidence for that, and as I said too, you got to look at things like sleep paralysis and that sort of thing as well. You've got to look at sort of out-of-body experiences, etc. But I really don't see any sort of hard physical evidence for there being aliens visiting Earth. I mean, there obviously is a physical component to it, and that's why you can have things like like saucer nests and that sort of thing, or burnt patches in the ground where these objects have supposedly landed. But this could be explained by plasma physics. These because these objects might in some cases be quite hot, could be a hot form of plasma, and also they could be emitting very powerful electromagnetic fields as well. So perhaps when people do come in close contact with these objects, they can stimulate the brain in such a way that person has a kind of visionary experience, I suppose.
Or maybe vice versa, maybe. I mean, there's a lot of groups. I mean, I participate in one myself, but there's a lot of groups now around the world that are, meditate. Yeah. Well, no, but this is an important point of it.
You guys should try we're meditating batteries next time.
We're meditating and focusing on, on UFOs, and they show up. I mean, the lights flashing, low flyers coming by. And I mean, I'm not saying they're ET, but they could be, who knows what it could be, but there's some connection there when we go out and look for them. And they didn't seem to be doing that in the 90s, but now they're, I'm hearing from groups all over the place that people are seeing stuff, and it's not planes, and it's not, it might be orbs, might be ball lightning, it might be other types of light phenomena, but it seems intelligent because it comes when we ask it to, and somewhat interacts with us. So how is there still room for without ET? There's still room for a couple things, but it's pretty hard to come up with a proper answer for that.
Yeah, look, I'm a big fan of Jacques Vallée's books on his approach to UFOlogy. Books like Passport to Magonia, where he looks at it in terms of or explores it in relation to like the fairy tradition and that sort of thing. Another way of looking at it too is in relation to the jinn tradition as well, which is this Arabic
almost a trickstery thing in a way.
Yeah, exactly. So that really, that those two sort of actually tie together. The fairy tradition, the jinn tradition, they seem to be saying pretty much the same thing. But the idea is that there are these, invisible beings that inhabit a parallel world, I suppose, that they can perceive us, but we can't perceive them, and that occasionally they can enter this dimension or this plane of existence, our dimension, and manifest physically for short periods of time, and basically, they're supposed to be shapeshifters. They can take on any form that they choose. So I think there's something going on there. I do believe that there's some other form of intelligence interacting with humanity, but I sort of see that more in terms of as I said, like the Jacques Vallée's ideas of this being the same thing as what I suppose our ancestors would have called fairies. So very similar thing to that. But as far as like extraterrestrials goes, I mean that's saying that they come from another planet, that they actually they come here from another part of the universe, and they have
physical
to come here
craft or whatever. Like it's more okay. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. But I don't discount that idea as well. I mean, that maybe some of these sightings that have happened were actually extraterrestrial in origin. So who knows?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Well, I want to touch back on something that we kind of skipped over a little bit, probably because it's one of the most important parts of your research, I think, and I don't think we hit it enough. And before we run out of time here, it's the negative health effects, or if there's enough research to show negative health effects from man-made artificial electromagnetic fields. So not the natural stuff that we've evolved to be a part of, but all this artificial stuff. Can you get into that a little bit more before we run out of time?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So all I can really say is that I think people should certainly look at the research that's been done in this. There are some very credible studies that have been done into this, looking at the adverse health effects of artificial electromagnetic fields. As I said, some of these studies indicate that it's possibly got to do with the suppression of the production of melatonin in the body, and that in turn, as I said, disrupts the sleep-wake cycle, lowers a person's immunity. There is other studies which indicate too that there could be some kind of stress response occurring as well, that it actually induces a state of stress in the body. And I, for a period, I lived in a house fitted with a smart meter. This was in 2012.
Oh, yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah, and I was working on a book at that stage, and so this device was installed in the home. Smart meters, of course, are just different to analog electricity meters that need to be read by a person. Smart meters actually transmit the data, directly to the electricity provider. So, and they use very short, sharp bursts of radio frequency radiation. And some of these bursts that have been measured are very strong. But basically, what happened was I was working on a book at that stage. I started to notice that I felt very agitated. And that my health just wasn't so good. My immune system didn't seem to be coping very well. And then I realized, oh, okay, well there has been a smart meter installed on the home. I wonder if that's got something to do with it.
Huh.
And I came across all these articles because they were rolling out smart meters throughout Melbourne at that stage. So they were just coming along and even without people's permission, etc. They were just taking out the analog electricity meter and installing a smart meter. And there were so many reports, or so many people describing very similar symptoms, this feeling of agitation, being very stressed, and not knowing why. And in some cases there were, people having to leave their homes and that sort of thing. They were saying that ever since this device was installed, that they just felt that they could not remain in their home. They had to just get out. It was sort of like they're in a state of panic, I suppose. So I think these are the things that people need to look out for. They need to obviously take into consideration their own mental health and that sort of thing, and not necessarily jump to conclusions. But I'd say in a lot of cases, what's really happening here is that it's really affecting people's mental health. It's causing or basically contributing to things like anxiety, depression, etc. Because there's kind of an epidemic of all these sort of mental health problems. And there is research into this. I mean, it is going back even in the 1970s. The Soviet researchers, Eastern European researchers, they came up with the term radio wave sickness to explain this condition where people were having all these health effects as a result of exposure to artificial sources of electromagnetism. They specifically listed, feelings of stress and irritability, headaches, etc. So all these things are definitely, people need to be very cautious, I think. And unfortunately, it's at a point where we can't do anything about it. We're just totally immersed in this stuff. But nonetheless, there are maybe small things you can do. You can certainly switch off devices in your house when you're not using them. I mean, I'd turn off the Wi-Fi when I'm not using it. I certainly don't sleep with it on. So we need to try and sort of minimize our exposure a little bit, because we don't know what sort of effect these things are having on the human body.
Yeah, that's a tough one, man. Because like if I shut my Wi-Fi off, there's probably like 20 other ones flying by that I can grab with my phone. So like,
exactly.
Is that I feel like it's just not even worth it. I mean, my Wi-Fi is probably not even the closest one to my head.
Yeah,
it's probably the neighbor's Wi-Fi that's right, like literally 10 feet past my window or something like that.
Ooh, if I shut off my Wi-Fi, there wouldn't be another Wi-Fi for a long time.
Wow, that's pretty good. So, I mean, the other thing is the smart meter can be quite the rabbit hole. Like, did you have to either tamper yourself from going down that rabbit hole, or I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff now. People are talking about spontaneous fires from the smart meters, and also the ability to measure exactly what you're doing inside the house, depending on the voltage and the stuff, and they can see your routine, and people have access to that information that they know exactly what I'm doing around my house just because of that smart meter. Like, did you get into any of that, or did you pretty much stick to the local problem that you were having with it?
Yeah, look, I mean, my wife at the time and I, we didn't stay in that house very long, so it was only like another 6 months or so when we ended up moving to another city. And certainly we didn't have any problems after that. We moved into a house that wasn't fitted with a smart meter, thankfully. But I think that the main thing is it's not necessarily the amount of electromagnetism or artificial electromagnetism in the environment. You've got to look at sort of, I suppose, specific frequencies and that kind of thing. People seem to be sensitive to certain types of frequencies. Very often it's sort of within the radio frequency range. So it'll be interesting to see what, probably a little bit scary too, to see what happens in the case of 5G, for example.
Yeah.
But I think too that people, should try and refrain from getting carried away with this stuff too, because I suppose basically we do have to live with it. We do have to tolerate it to some extent. There's just nothing else we can do. I mean, it might mean in some cases that a person might need to take better care of their mental health or something like that, or maybe even talk to a psychologist or what have you. But yeah, as I said, the experiment is happening right now, so we are very much the guinea pigs in all this. It's not a very comforting thought. But yeah, what can you do? I mean, it's there's money in it, in this technology. It can't be stopped at this point. It's No,
we're gonna evolve to deal with it physically, probably. Over the decades, over the generations, they'll just become a part of it, or we'll become resilient, or the weak ones will die off, or however that's gonna happen.
Exactly. Maybe that's the case. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's going to pave the way for artificial intelligence taking over.
Yeah,
because they'll be able to maybe tolerate this stuff and we won't.
Maybe that's the only reason we're here.
Yeah. Oh, Darren, going back to this.
Usher that in. That's it. We're just here to feed the simulation. It's going to eat us. Right on. Well, thanks for getting up early on your. I don't know if is it a holiday weekend over there in Tasmania?
Well, fortunately, I'm not working today. But yeah, no, I've had a few days off recently. So yeah, in order to do these sorts of things, do interviews and that sort of thing, I only work on a casual basis. But yeah, no, it's getting up to midday over here in Tassie. But it's been fantastic talking to you guys.
Tassie, baby. So
yeah, that's good.
How many people are in Tassie?
How many people?
Do you know Gordon White?
Well, I know how many people are in where I live in Burnie, which is sort of around 20,000. It's it's a pretty small place, pretty isolated. But Tassie itself, I'm not too sure, but it hasn't got a very big population, that's for sure. We are very much, obviously cut off from the mainland, and Tassie's a sort of a world in itself, I suppose. People would say that things are a little bit backwards here, I suppose. Yeah.
I bet it's wonderful.
So when's your book coming out then? Your new one, the one on Borderland phenomena.
Yeah, yep. So that's being published by August Night Books, which is Robbie Graham's publishing company.
Oh.
It's affiliated with White Crow Books.
Nice.
So it's been a good opportunity to work with Robbie. He's a fine publisher and so on. And
we had him on
written
too.
some good books himself. But yeah, no, it's coming out in January. So January next year.
Okay.
It should be. Yeah.
Awesome. We'll keep an eye open for it, and we'll link to it, and we'll link to all your other stuff as well, all the other books, and
we'll have you on again. We're gonna chat again here in the new year, early in the new year, and we'll talk about the moon.
Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic.
Good,
Look forward to it.
Yeah, that's one of our favorite topics. Thanks, buddy.
Right on. Enjoy the day over in Tassie.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Take
Bye
care.
For now.
Okay,
Bye.
There you have it, Louis Proud.
Louis.
King Louis.
Geez, you tried to railroad him a couple times there, eh? Calling Reich a Nazi and all kinds of stuff. What was it? What's gotten into you on this? No more Sunday afternoon interviews.
I thought. Well, I don't know. I heard Wilhelm Reich. I thought Nazi.
Jesus.
For some reason, I got caught up in. I thought I was thinking Project Paperclip.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. But I mean, just to
He
throw
did
it
not
out
see
there
that
like
coming.
that, he did not, no.
You got nervous.
Yeah, well, I mean, especially nowadays. Geez.
Yeah.
He's throwing that out there.
He already doesn't do a lot of podcasts.
Yeah. Now he's never going to come back.
Yeah, he's coming back.
Oh, they're calling people Nazis on there. They're throwing F-bombs around.
Oh, there's a couple F-bombs. He rolled with them pretty good, though.
Yeah, he was a good sport.
Big thanks to King Louis over in Tassie for coming on the show.
You ever heard of Map of Tassie? Do you know what that is?
No.
Map of Tassie?
It's a map of Tasmania?
Yeah. Do you know what it is? It's a symbol for something.
No. I don't know. The Tasmanian devil?
China.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Why is that?
It's in that shape.
Oh.
They say, nice map of Tassie.
Who says that? Australians?
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Okay. Does it have like a mountain? No, let's not get into it. Big thanks to Louis for coming on the show. Of course, he did that great book on the moon as well. So we're going to do another show about that down the road. Of course, half our listeners who think the moon doesn't exist aren't going to tune into that one. But what can you do? We can't make everyone happy over here in Grimerica. We try, though. We do try. Check out grimerica.ca/support, guys, so you can check out all the different options you can do to support the show. Actually, nowadays, you just enter your own. You can pick a monthly, yearly, one time. Support the show.
Yeah, we do need your help with bills.
We need your help. Otherwise, we can't. We can't do it. It costs a fortune over here, and we don't even have a roof over our heads at this point. So we need some support. It really does help out. And and then you get to do things like get tickets to CAC before everyone else. So you get to go do the Randall Carlson hangout while other people are still waiting because they don't support the Grimerica show.
That's all you can handle with Randall in Colorado.
Or Randall Occurrence.
Yeah.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah.
Ground will be there too, so will I. Get your tickets, motherfuckers. Grimerica.ca/support. Everything else is in the newsletter. It's all in the newsletter. Check out the newsletter right now. Do everything in the newsletter. And then enjoy the rest of your weekend. All right, guys. thanks for listening, and we will see you next week. I'll wrap up the live feed. Thanks for tuning in on this Sunday afternoon. Bye-bye.